these sheets, they're flames. And I'm such a sinner that I deserve it. I mean, there is a big problem if you're loving God in the same way that you're loving Bieber. Love is willing the best for another, even when we don't feel like it. In a world without truth, this is the fatal risk facing love. Love gets degenerated to sentimentality. It becomes abused and distorted. The word love becomes abused and distorted to the point it comes to mean the opposite. I mean, really, love loses its essence when it's divorced from truth, when it's just merely sentimental. And it gets hijacked by our emotions. We can try to do good things, but if it's not met with truth or done in truth, it can do some really bad things. I mean, can you think of any examples of where people are, out of a genuine sense of sincerity and a genuine feeling of maybe emotional love, are actually doing some really bad things? You know, here at SEEK, we have Abby Johnson. And Abby Johnson was a former executive for Planned Parenthood. And if you hear Abby speak, she talks about actually, directing this Planned Parenthood and being a regional director of Planned Parenthood, and doing it out of a sincere feeling that she was doing something good for women. Right? There was actually sincerity, but I would argue that this is what the Pope is talking about, of love can lose its essence. It can turn against mankind when it's not actually met with truth. And I think that's precisely why God has called us to love him, not only with our heart, but also with our mind, which is the next component of what God has called us to do, right? Love God with your whole heart and your whole mind. Because what does it look like to love God with our whole mind? What is the implication of loving God with our whole mind? The implication of loving God with our whole mind is that we seek truth. We discover the design that God has for us. We figure out what the big questions are in life and what the church teaches. We are led to truth and we're driven by truth when we can love God with our mind. You know, St. Ignatius of Loyola, who's a great saint, he's one of my favorites, but he actually speaks of us having a moral obligation to use our logic and intellect to make decisions in life, right? Because think about it, if God has created us, he's given us a gift of logic and intellect. That is a gift that we have. And we are morally obligated to use that. And that is why God says we're morally obligated to love him with our mind as well as our heart. But Jesus even one-upped what was commanded, or what St. Ignatius says. He described it as one of the most important commandments. He used it to describe one of the most important commandments, loving God with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole soul. He used it as a scripture. The mind, we have to use it. The good news is, brothers and sisters, though, that the church teachings make sense. If we're called to use our logic and intellect, if you search for the truth, you're going to discover it and find it. There's nothing that is taught that is not thoroughly logical and explained if you dig for answers. Now, on the contrary, what happens if we love God with our mind only? Now, in Spanish, there's actually a distinction between knowing facts and knowing people. There's a verb called conocer, which means to know people, and a verb saber, which means to know things about people. And you would never use, or if you did use saber to know facts or things about people, or if you did use saber, it would just uniquely mean that you know facts or things about them. You'll say algo de this person. I know something about them. But that is not actually what we're called to do. We're actually called to be in a relationship with God, right? If we only know things about God, we actually don't know how to be in a relationship with him. If we only know facts about him, right? And we are called to be in relationship with him. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be in a relationship with people that you only know facts about. And if we only love God with our mind, we can learn theology, we can learn apologetics, we can win debates, but we're never going to know what communion with God is actually like. Knowledge alone is not faith, and it's certainly not love. Now, how about the whole soul? How about attempting to love God with the whole soul? And there have been manifestations of this in a lot of points of history. It's called Puritanism, right? And it's the idea, and it relies heavily on the idea that the body is bad, but the soul is good. Do you know how the early pilgrims in the United States that came over in like 1620 celebrated Christmas? In fact, how they celebrated Christmas between the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in the United States? They didn't. They didn't at all. In fact, they called it Fool's Tide because everything they did was for the safety of their souls. They felt like celebration put their souls at risk, so they wouldn't dare delve into any kind of celebration. In fact, on the first 25th of December, when they got to the United States, or to the New World, and they're in Plymouth Colony, they actually spent the day working in fields as they would any other day. They made Jesus cry, baby Jesus cry. I don't even know what Santa did. So with this concept of body bad and soul good, we could completely overlook how God has commanded us to love him with also our emotion. You know, loving God with emotion is not an all bad thing either. Emotion is what gives tenderness to relationships. But if we're just trying to protect our soul, we're not going to be in that relationship with him. And we're not going to have that emotion that we're called to have to love God also. So, obviously, what God has called us to is an integrated love of him. And what does that look like in our lives when we love him with our whole heart, our whole mind, and our whole soul? It's that our hearts burn with love for him. Our souls are prepared to meet him, and our minds are active in the pursuit of truth. That's the commandment. That is what loving God is, that we are loving him with our whole being. Everything that he has given us, from our intellect to our emotion to our very souls. That is how he's commanded us to love us. But now let's shift gears a little bit, because Jesus Christ also had that second bonus piece, which was, you shall love the Lord God and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? That's a really important component. So, when we talk about loving our neighbor, I want to particularly highlight in today's session the importance of loving Christ in the poor, loving God in the poor, and loving the poor just in their humanity. And why do I want to do that? I want to do that because, you know, the commandment to love God with your whole mind, heart, and soul came in chapter 22 of the Gospel of Matthew. But in chapter 25, Jesus Christ gives us perhaps the most concrete criteria of how to attain salvation that we get anywhere in the Gospels, right? In chapter 25, he says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. Imprisoned, and you visited me." I mean, loving the poor seems to be a further expansion of that commandment that he gave us, right? Now, Mother Teresa, do we have any Mother Teresa fans out there? Yeah, amen. She used to say that you could sum up the gospel, the entirety of the gospel, in 5 words. You did it to me. I mean, I love Mother Teresa. In fact, you know, one of my favorite things to do is like when people say like, religious extremism is wrong. I'm like, Mother Teresa was the best religious extremist that ever existed in the world, right? You know, what do we call religious extremists in the Catholic Church? We call them saints. So it's not all bad. So, but I've been blessed to work with the Missionaries of Charity, and through Focus Missions, we do a lot of work with the Missionaries of Charity around the world. And the Missionaries of Charity, we were with the Missionary of Charity Fathers in Mexico City this last spring, and one of the priests reminded us that Jesus Christ loves us through the sacraments, and he shows us his mercy through confession, right? And he shows us all the tenderness and gives us the graces that we need, all the love that we need through the sacraments. But it's in loving the poor that we are actually able to love God back. It's how we give back to God. It's how we console him in his suffering. And if you've ever worked in environments of extreme poverty, you'll know that Christ is truly present in the poor. And I've taken groups to Calcutta on mission about 3 times. And every time, I could say it was the most profound experience of Christ that I've ever had. If you go to Calcutta, it's absolutely one of the most heart-wrenching places that you can visit. It's still, there are people dying on the streets. It hasn't changed, unfortunately, that much since the time that Mother Teresa just took the first step out in the streets to go pick up people who are dying. And people are so impoverished, and they're the outcasts. They're the lowest caste in the system. And if they get a scratch on their arm and it gets infected, and they get a blood infection, because they're bathing in the sewers, literally, they get weak, and there's no one to take care of them. And they get so weak that they lay on the sidewalk, and people can't even lift their head off the sidewalk. And all of a sudden, they get sores, and it's just absolutely horrific. And the smells in Calcutta, that's the one thing, it's really extreme. If you're a smell person, you're going to have to work up to going to Calcutta. And the story goes was that a young volunteer had arrived to Calcutta to work with the poor there. And Mother Teresa, and he was just, when he was seeing scenes like this, and he's working in a home for the dying, he's just like, I want to keep my distance. I'm a germaphobe, right? But Mother Teresa saw this volunteer specifically, and she took him out on the streets with her. And they found a guy who was just right on his deathbed. And she looked at this young volunteer, and she said, my son, pick up this man, pick up your brother. And this volunteer is just like absolutely disgusted with this. I mean, you can only imagine like maybe maggots in these wounds, and the smells, and he's covered with feces. And so he kind of slides his hands under the guy and just picks up this like guy who's like a feather. He has no weight on him, but is covered with sores. And they get a taxi, and they sit him in the back of the taxi. And he's sitting in this taxi with this guy on top of him. And I mean, the smell, I'm sure, is asphyxiating. The temperature is like 110 degrees, and he does not want to do this. But hey, if Mother Teresa told me to do this, I think I'd be doing it too, right? And he takes this guy in, and she said, now, my son, take his clothes off. I mean, it's like the last thing he wants to do. So he gets this guy, and he's just barely, peeling off layers of clothing, just the rags that he has. Probably this guy's, some of his skin is coming off too. And she looks at him and she says, now bathe him. And this guy's like, I don't want to touch this. And so he's like splashing some water on him. And all of a sudden, the story goes that people saw it, he shuddered. He absolutely shuddered. And he just started scrubbing him like vigorously. And all of a sudden he started crying, and he's just like pouring love into what he's doing. And Mother Teresa looked over at him and said, you saw him, didn't you? You saw him, didn't you? He saw Jesus Christ in the poor. So loving our neighbor actually is a means to loving God himself. And that is a piece of the commandment. Love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, whole soul. But loving your neighbor is how we love God himself. We should love the poor so that both giver and receiver can better understand the mercy and love of God. Without that witness of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, how would they know the tenderness and mercy that God has of him? But it's really important to highlight that Jesus Christ says that there's a huge similarity between the first commandment and the second commandment. He said, love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And he says, but the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So what does that mean? That means we actually have to apply a little bit of what we know from the first commandment to how we love the poor, right? Because there's danger if we just love the poor emotionally. If we love the poor just merely emotionally, it could be, at times, just to make ourselves feel good. And that's not how we love the poor. Loving in truth or with our whole mind would actually involve getting a person a meal because we know that they are hungry. And if we love them with our heart, we are loving them and have an emotional connection because we could see Jesus Christ and the dignity present in them. I mean, could you imagine a missionary going to like an impoverished, starving village and, they're missionaries and they go in and they bring this gigantic pallet of food and people are rejoicing and then they just leave? Okay, well, that's kind of loving the poor just with your mind, right? What about these people's soul? What about their emotion? Do they know anyone cares about them? No. And so if we fall into some of these fallacies, there's great dangers in this, and we can start to love the poor simply in the way that the secular world addresses poverty. And there's a big difference between the Christian approach to poverty and the secular world's approach to poverty. And I want to talk about that a bit. Let's tease that out a little bit. First of all, as a Christian, we love the poor, right? We've already said a little bit of why we love the poor. But we love them, again, in the integrated way, with our whole heart, mind, and soul. I mean, we do everything we can to raise them out of poverty. We do everything we can to eradicate poverty. This is why the Catholic Church is the biggest charitable organization in the history of mankind. No one has fed more people than the Catholic Church. No one has clothed more people than the Catholic Church. No one has educated more people than the Catholic Church. It is the largest organization in the history of mankind that has done the most charitable work in the history of mankind because we're following that commandment. But inevitably, even despite everything that the Catholic Church does, do you guys know how much poverty there is in the world? 1 in 7 children born today are born into an urban slum. That's a UN statistic. 1 in 7 children. That's unfathomable. How many kids are born into absolute squalor? So what does that mean? It means that we do everything that we can to love the poor, to bring them out of the poor, but there's still going to be too many to help. And Jesus actually alludes to this in Matthew chapter 26, just after he gives us this, you did it to me verse. In the next verse, he says, you will always have the poor with you. That means Jesus Christ saying, yeah, you'll have the poor with you, maybe, as in fellowship with them, but they're always going to be there. So Jesus Christ actually readily admits that the poor are going to be there. So what happens from a Catholic standpoint when we know that there's too many to help? What do? We live in solidarity with the poor. We live in solidarity with the poor. This is the Catholic answer to that. If you've ever been sick, if you've ever faced tragedy in your life, if you've ever been in a situation of pressure or something, there's nothing that helps more than having someone be there at your side. Even if they can't do anything for you, just being there for you and letting you know you care, letting you know that they care, that's actually a service. That's an expression of love. This is how a Christian is called to love the poor when we can't do anything more. Now, on the contrary, let's look at the secular approach. The first thing that we do is we ask, in a secular world, how can we enrich these poor people, right? And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's micro enterprises out there, and there's great education out there. They're trying to give people tools to, better their circumstances. That's all good. In fact, that's Catholic too. But inevitably, like on the Christian approach, there's going to be too many poor to help. We can't make everyone rich in the world. So what happens when that happens? What happens when there are too many poor to take care of in the secular standpoint? The aim shifts to eradicating the poor. Now, what do I mean by that? There are massive programs out there for sterilization, for contraception, for abortion. right? You might have seen the news this last November where 15 women died in a sterilization health clinic in India after they were offered $23 a piece to get sterilized. Can you imagine a starving person all of a sudden getting offered money to go, sterilize them? And they went to these crude, horrible medical facilities, and 15 women died in one of these campaigns. It made international headlines. But along with those headlines, the fact came out that there are laws in place that if you have more than 3 children, you're not actually eligible to run for office in a local village, right? And the lawmakers had actually referred to the poor as irresponsible breeders, right? So there's this question of, do we actually love the poor, or do we actually hate poverty? Do we love the poor, or do we hate poverty? And that is the difference between the two approaches. If it's pure emotion, too, we can fall into that trap of just hating poverty and not loving the poor, because we're not recognizing their dignity. We're not recognizing how we're called to love God in all 3 ways. And why is that particularly? Because poverty is an assault on our senses. It is not comfortable to see the poor. It wasn't comfortable probably for you to hear what it's like in Calcutta, or what it was like for that young man to pick up that person who had infected wounds. It's an assault on us. It's an assault on our senses, right? So we have to get beyond that. We have to love the poor in the integrated way that God has called us to. Another point. As Christians, we recognize the value of suffering, right? Suffering is not a good thing, but God can use it for good, right? In fact, the worst evil that has ever been committed in the world was killing the Son of God. But it was through his suffering and cross that we were redeemed. The greatest good that ever came out of humanity was that of our salvation, of Jesus Christ. The greatest good that ever happened in the world came out of suffering. And so from a Christian standpoint, although we try to alleviate suffering in every way we can, we recognize that God can use it for good because there is life beyond. But on the other hand, if from a secular point of view, suffering is the number one ill. Suffering is actually the goal to eradicate, right? First, because it's offensive to us, but also the value of life without God is all about seeking the here and now, seeking the pleasure that will only fulfill me, or that we think is going to fulfill me in this life, right? So I think it comes back to us, brothers and sisters. I mean, we are called to strive to love God with our whole heart, our whole mind, our whole soul. We are called to love so that our hearts burn with him. We're called to know our God and to strive for the truth, to figure out every answer to the church, to dig for those answers that we have questions on. We don't have to be experts in everything, but we need to dig for that truth and pursue God with our whole mind. And we need to have our soul in the right place by pursuing the grace that God has given us in the sacraments. But likewise, to attain heaven, we need to love the poor in the same way. We need to love them in the distressing disguise of the poor. So, us modern scholars of the law who are trying to figure out how to make it to heaven, let's not forget that you shall love God in this way, and go forth and take action. So thank you so much.
Mercy is divine love poured out on misery. Compassion with to suffer. You are made by God's love. You are made for God's love. God's love, which is infinite, inexhaustible, and unconditional, is always super abundant.